This is DW News. We are streaming live from Berlin. I'm Melissa Chan.
And I'm Hannah Hummel.
We're here to give you a bit of the latest on the Iran war, but then take a closer look at the ripple effects of the conflict, focusing on the impact on Europe, and particularly on how this war in the Middle East is impacting another front line, that between Russia and Ukraine. We'll be speaking to our correspondent in Kyiv, along with an expert. And in the studio, we have DW's Middle East analyst, Shani Razanis. Shani, welcome as always.
Happy to be here, as always.
And now, since this is all online, we really are encouraging you guys, our viewers, to post your comments and your questions in the chat. I'm going to be monitoring all of that to make sure that we can answer everything that you guys want to know. So don't be shy. This is your chance to connect with the reporters directly covering this conflict.
Now, a quick recap of where things stand. The conflict in the Middle East appears to be widening further on day 6 of the fighting. Azerbaijan says 2 drones were launched from Iran into its territory. And Iran has continued its drone strikes on Israel and on Gulf states where U.S. assets are located. 6 people were injured by debris from an intercepted drone in the Emirati capital of Abu Dhabi. Israel's continued its attacks on Iran and Lebanon, where it says it's targeting Iran-backed Hezbollah. Now, beyond the Middle East, the U.S. torpedoed an Iranian warship in international waters off Sri Lanka yesterday, killing at least 87 sailors. Tehran accused the U.S. of committing a, quote, atrocity with the sinking. So let's start with Shani in the studio first. As I said, we'll be looking at second-order effects in Europe. But before we go to Europe, this conflict has engulfed the Gulf and the rest of the Middle East. Give us an update of that over the last 24 hours or so.
Well, I don't want to say we're seeing more of the same, but what we're seeing is quite 2 relentless powers, fighting against each other, or actually 3. The U.S. and the Americans' joint attack is very much still pounding at Tehran, trying to erode more of their missile stockpiles, as well as reaching some of the infrastructure of the regime. At the same time, Iran, together, synchronized with Hezbollah, keeps hitting rockets and drones at Israel. And again, we also see occasional spillovers to other countries in the region. This is going on. I think that for itself is just to show us that whoever thought or tried to sell us a quick in and out, a blast operation that can be easily wrapped up, was maybe, too optimistic, to say the least. And we need to also keep in mind that wherever it is that would be the exit ramp, whatever would be the way, out of this, it's going to have to be something that both sides can agree on. And now they seem so far from each other. I'm afraid we're very far from any pause in the fighting.
So that's the situation out of the Middle East. Now on to Europe, of course. Different countries seem to be responding in different ways, despite the fact that it's supposed to be the European Union.
Well, the European Union is not united. We know it for a while. Ukraine for itself is still a point that they're arguing. But when it comes to this attack, they're in quite of a bind. They're in a dilemma because, of course, they're not too happy with the idea of Iranian missiles threatening Europe. They're happy to see that threat removed. They're also not too happy with the idea of nuclear Iran. But at the same time, they're very much concerned about the way this attack was planned and executed, basically trampling all over world, convention of international law and consensus, coalition building. But what we are also seeing in the last days is both, there's been very heated relationship between Europe and Trump. And I think both sides are realizing reluctantly in the last days that they actually still need each other. It's not quite clear who needs whom, but it's clear that there is still dependency there.
That's very interesting. We'll get a lot more into that, but I understand, Hannah, like you've been looking at just one example of how complicated things have gotten for Europe, particularly in this case, the country you were looking at is the UK.
Of course. So the UK, along with its European allies, is really rallying to send support to defend the EU member state, Cyprus. I mean, I'm sure many of you are all aware of the fact that that there was a drone strike on the British RAF base there. That happened on Monday after this drone somehow managed to evade detection. And the UK Defence Secretary has now arrived on the island to reinforce Britain's relationship with Cyprus there in the face of these Iranian threats. Keir Starmer has said that the UK is sending helicopters with drone capabilities and a warship. Spain will also be sending its most capable warship. Yes, that footage that you're seeing there is of the strike that happened on Monday. That is user-generated footage there. It's not verified, but you can see quite clearly what's going on there. France has also said that it's going to be sending an aircraft carrier. Greece and Italy are sending naval assets to Cyprus. And France, in quite a big move, has now also authorised the use of its bases in the Middle East for the US. This is a pretty big deal considering the pressure that Spain came under for refusing Washington access to its bases in the Middle East. And regarding that strike that happened there, the news agency AP has reported that they were told by an official in Cyprus that Monday's airstrike was launched from Lebanon. And that it was a drone launched from the capital of Beirut. Now, it is important to mention that this will not be coming from the Lebanese government, but likely the militant group Hezbollah, which is backed by Iran. The Lebanese government has banned military activities by Hezbollah after it opened fire on Israel to avenge the killing of Iran's supreme leader. But that ban has been rejected by a senior Hezbollah politician. So, yeah, quite a big deal over there.
And I see that we've got that map of Cyprus up.
Totally.
For
so it's
people.
that southern base there at Kratiri that was hit by that drone strike.
All right, so that's just one example. But of course, the big question for a lot of people when you think about Europe and these ripple effects from the conflict in Iran is how it's going to impact Ukraine. And so I'm very glad that we have Nick Connolly in Kyiv, our DW correspondent there, joining us. Nick, hello.
Good afternoon.
Great to have you. And I want to start first by running a soundbite from Vladimir Zelensky, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, in terms of his message to the United States, to Israel, and the Middle East in terms of how Ukraine can help. Let's have a listen.
Partners are turning to us, to Ukraine, asking for help in defending against Shahed drones, with expertise and real operational experience. There have also been requests from the American side. In recent days, I have spoken with leaders of the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Jordan, and Kuwait. There will also be negotiations with other regional leaders. We are coordinating with our European partners as well. Of course, any assistance we provide will only be on the condition that it does not weaken our own defense in Ukraine, and that it serves as an investment in our diplomatic opportunities. We help those defend themselves from war who help us, Ukraine, move closer to a just end to this war.
So, Nick, can you tell us a little bit more about the help that Zelensky is talking about?
I think we are still all scratching our heads here in Kyiv trying to work out what exactly that would look like. When you hear Zelensky saying we're not going to do anything that would diminish our capacity here to hold the front lines, that basically means, are we not going to maybe send large numbers of people now during this war? There was a suggestion from Zelensky earlier on that he would only send teams to the Middle East if there was some kind of ceasefire here, which Russia gives no indication of wanting. I think certainly there is know-how. Ukraine has pioneered ways of dealing with these drones using acoustic systems, because these systems, these Shahed drones, are very noisy. They have very noisy engines, and that is a way of finding them because they fly very low and very slow, so traditional radars often struggle to pinpoint them. That's something obviously that Ukraine can share some of the software systems it uses to kind of manage these threats and to help the teams trying to take these Shaheds out. That's something that they can pass on, but certainly they want to get something in return. There have been suggestions by experts here in Ukraine that maybe Gulf states will provide finance to buy American weapons for Ukraine in return for this help. That this is also just a diplomatic kind of signal to the US that Ukraine does have cards. Ukraine does have know-how and experience of dealing with these Iranian drones that have been taken on by the Russians recently in a way that most other countries of the West don't have. But in terms of concrete steps, we really don't know. Certainly, there's been a lot of frustration here in Ukraine about the willingness of lots of those Gulf states to carry on doing business with Russia, providing financial services to Russia. So maybe that is some leverage that Ukraine can use there to try and force those Gulf states to move a bit away from Russia.
Yeah, you say that Ukraine has a few cards now, of course, hearkening to that famous Oval Office meeting between Zelensky and Trump, when U.S. President Donald Trump had said to Zelensky that you don't have any cards. It does look like Ukraine can help in this case. Now, I want to talk about Iran's use of drones because they seem to be successful to the extent that, at a minimum, they're disrupting the business as usual in the Middle East. Of course, in the Gulf, it's preventing the tourism from happening. It's preventing commercial flights from taking off, and of course, strategically hitting those U.S. military bases across the region. Nick, as someone who's covered asymmetric warfare, and you know so much about drone warfare, what patterns are you seeing in the fighting in the Middle East that is similar to what you've seen in Ukraine?
I think the main thing about the Shahed drones is that they are incredibly cheap. By most estimates, the Russian version of these drones costs about $20,000 at minimum. There's some suggestions that Iran's may be able to do this even more cheaply. So it's about having just numbers to overwhelm those air defenses and to eventually force your adversary to waste a lot more money shooting down those drones than it costs to build them. Right now, we've seen obviously lots of ballistic missiles coming in the way of the United Arab Emirates, for instance, and those being downed with the help of very expensive Patriot systems. But even suggestions that expensive interceptors are also being wasted, as it were, on these Shahed. And eventually, when those stocks run low, then those defenses are overwhelmed, and some of these drones get through. Lots of these drones that, for instance, Russia uses against Ukraine don't even have a warhead. They're just there to overwhelm, to flood the zone, as it were, flood the air defenses, and make it easier for the ones that then do carry a warhead to get through. And often it can be just equally about creating insecurity, the sense of insecurity, and psychological warfare. Often enough, you'll have them here in Kiev flying pretty low above the roofs behind me here in downtown Kiev, not obviously going for any target, and that is just something that people either learn to kind of filter out, or just means that life becomes one endless kind of stretch of just looking at the people's phones, expecting the next air alert, and going down to the shelter. So these are incredibly cheap weapons, and it is a real kind of difference kind of philosophy of fighting a war to what the West has done in the last decades, where we've had very high-tech, very expensive systems made in relatively small numbers in the expectation that these expensive air defense systems or expensive attack systems will achieve their result within a very short period of time, and there wouldn't be the need for having these big stocks. And the other interesting thing about all this is that these Shahed drones can be built with basically commercially available parts. You don't need necessarily weapons-grade electronics. Even countries under extensive sanctions like Russia and Iran are able to buy these electronics in places like Turkey or Hong Kong and put these drones together, and the damage that they can inflict is very serious. This is a very serious, scary weapon. When you see the images of those drones going in for that final descent and then blowing up, they can carry often warheads of almost 100 kilos. And that is a very, very serious threat. That is not just a small drone with.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but I just want to make clear that all that footage that we were just showing our viewers is exactly what you're just talking about there, Nick. And you can really see the impact, especially there in Bahrain, of those drones.
So those are screenshots, or what are we
exactly.
looking at there?
This is footage from various different people who've been posting on X the same strike, and there's so many videos out there that show exactly what's been going on there in Bahrain, and it's pretty mega.
Yeah, Nick, please continue. But we definitely wanted to flag that to viewers just now.
Definitely. I just think the interesting thing to point out is that this weapon is so successful in its Russian and its Iranian iterations that now the Americans are copying it. There is so-called Lucas, which is the American variant of this, that's been built by American companies under license from the US government, that's basically reverse engineered this system that they found on the battlefields here in Ukraine and come across elsewhere. We understand that the American variant costs upwards of $35,000 to produce, so somewhat more expensive than the Russian-Iranian versions. But the fact that the US, with its huge military-industrial base, is now copying Iranian innovation just shows you quite how effective a weapon that is.
Nick, I want to ask you another question, but Hannah, just want to check on chat and questions too. So look them up, and then Nick, let me throw the question to you first. You've talked about the lessons that Ukraine can teach, particularly with drones, but anything else that the U.S. and Israel should be paying attention to strategically? Had they been paying attention to this kind of asymmetry between Ukraine and Russia?
I think it's just all about stockpiles, about having that depth and that ability to keep on going, right? I think that's maybe less a question maybe for the US, but definitely European militaries. When you hear off-the-record briefings from European military leaders, they always say, we have all this wonderful kit, but we only have ammunition for about 3-4 days before we'd have to call it a day. There was a suggestion last year during the so-called 12-day war that basically, the kind of attacks were called off when Israel, the US were running low on stocks, and similar thing here. I think because Western militaries are so dependent on very specialized spare parts that are only produced by a small number of companies with very limited staffing and ability to kind of increase their production. There is a natural kind of limit to the ability to go on. That's why now we're hearing that the Israeli and US strikes are increasingly going at attacking missile sites because they just don't know if they would have the capacity to keep on intercepting those missiles if this were to go on for weeks and weeks. So easier to try and take out the missile launchers, the missile sites, rather than hoping that there'll be capacity to keep on intercepting these missiles. If you look at the numbers, they're not really very definitive, but there was talk of 600-700 ballistic missiles having been sent by Iran towards the Gulf over the first few days of this conflict.
Right.
And that is already in itself more than the US produces in terms of interceptor missiles for the Patriot every year. That's about 600. So that just gives you a sense of quite how limited the supply of these interceptor missiles is.
And I just really want to quickly mention that the footage that you just saw there were of drone strikes in Ukraine. But Shani, I know you wanted to say something.
I want to offer another lesson we can maybe draw from, Iran, Ukraine, Russia, and maybe how we can implement it on Iran in this conflict. When this war started in Ukraine 4 years ago, it was clear who has the superiority when it came to weapons, to demographics, to economic forces. Russia was definitely, at the lead there. Nonetheless, we have seen Ukraine far weaker, far smaller, managing to give an amazing fight. Even if it felt back then it doesn't have enough allies, it doesn't have enough forces. So again, what we're talking here about, Iran being isolated, Iran being definitely, in inferiority when it comes to the might of the American military, definitely joined with the Israeli. There's very clear imbalance of power there, but it doesn't guarantee a success, as we've seen also in other cases like the Russian-Ukrainian one.
Absolutely. All right, Hannah, what do you got for us?
Well, we've got some great questions coming through. One which I think Nick has answered already, but if you'd like to add any more. Will Ukraine's experience in drone warfare play a role in the Iran war?
So it definitely sounds like at least we got it right on the money.
Totally,
that we're asking the right
we're
questions.
Covering the right topics.
Glad
definitely.
to hear that.
And then I have
else?
another one from someone asking that they've heard talk of the fact that the US war in Iran could effectively increase the Russian war chest against Ukraine due to an increase in oil prices. Does the EU have any way of counteracting this at all?
That is a really great question. Can we lob that over to Nick in terms of Russia and the oil prices going up, benefiting the Russian economy and increasing its economic war chest to fight its war on Ukraine?
Well, this definitely couldn't have come at a better time for Vladimir Putin. We really saw the Russian budget suffering, regional governments basically unable to meet their kind of social obligations, state-run companies unable to pay their debts, a real pressure in Russia to kind of collect more taxes, small businesses being pushed to really cough up because those oil revenues were just not producing the kind of financial buffer that Russia had gotten used to. We'd had oil prices for Russia around $40 a barrel because obviously there are big discounts on Russian oil because of all the sanctions and complications around it. And now there's a real sense here that, if this carries on for a while, Russia will be getting $15, $20, $25 more a barrel pretty soon. And that could really get them out of the worst financial pressures that would then, have maybe forced Russia to agree to some kind of deal. The Russian state budget for this year was planning on a kind of medium price of $59, $60 a barrel. So if we actually get there, then potentially Russia is able to fight for a whole lot longer without putting the Russian population under that kind of financial strain. So that's really unwelcome from a Ukrainian perspective. And the thing that the EU can do is obviously buy less Russian energy, right? The EU mostly stopped buying oil direct from the Russians at the beginning of this war, with the exception of Slovakia and Hungary. Right now, that pipeline that was still connecting Russia with Hungary through Ukraine is out of action. The Ukrainians say it was destroyed in a Russian strike and can't be repaired in a hurry. There's a lot of pressure now from the EU to get that pipeline running again. And at the same time, they talk about, at preventing the shadow fleet from bringing in, Russian oil across the world, or, they still buy Russian gas by tanker. So there is a huge kind of question mark there from a Ukrainian perspective. Why are you on one hand pushing us to kind of restore those supplies of Russian oil to Hungary and Slovakia when you talk about, you know, reducing reliance on Russia? So there is still a whole lot there that the EU can do in terms of reducing its purchases of Russian energy. And in terms of sanctions, there are lots of sanctions that are already on the books, but it's a question of actually implementing them, right? This is something that requires a lot of energy, a lot of time, a lot of human hours to actually go after all these shell companies that, you know, appear every time that the sanctions change or one player is taken out of the mix. And there is a lot of complaint here in Ukraine that there just simply isn't the kind of manpower, the kind of energy, the bureaucratic energy on the part of European governments to actually make these sanctions work.
Nick, it sounds like it's very windy in Kyiv. You can hear a little bit of that on your mic, but I am hearing you very clearly, and I just want to follow up with what you've just said and ask. Alternatively, you've talked about Russia benefiting from this, but hasn't Russia relied on Iran in terms of providing military assistance? And that obviously is going to be something that Tehran wants to keep for itself now.
So I'll try and move the mic up a bit. Maybe that'll make things a bit better.
Thank you very much.
I think I think in terms of the Shahed drone, that is basically over, right? At the beginning of this war, when those Shaheds were a new thing, Russia was getting them delivered either kind of fully manufactured from Iran or largely just getting the spare parts to then be put together in Russia. Now this is essentially a Russian weapon with Chinese spare parts. I don't think they rely on direct deliveries from Iran in any major sense. Obviously they get some, but it's not crucial. There were deliveries also of shorter range ballistic missiles from Iran, but again, Russia is, you know, a net exporter of weapons. I don't think they are particularly dependent on this. So I think, you know, it is obviously damaging in terms of the kind of PR that Russia hasn't been able to help its partner in Iran. But I think the kind of baseline, the win in terms of cash through risen oil prices, and then also the perspective of potentially fewer air defense missiles available for Ukraine, that is a net win, I think, for Russia.
Nick Kashani here in the studio. I want to quickly ask you, what do you think will be the effect of this on the negotiations? Because in the last rounds of talks in Geneva, the Americans were talking, on the one hand, you know, bouncing back and forth between Iran and Iran talks and Russia-Ukraine talks. Could you see how the need for Trump to show that he's managing to get some achievements would lead to far more pressure on Ukraine to get some sort of a deal, to get some sort of an agreement with Russia, so he can at least say he has managed to finish that war?
I mean, that's one potential kind of scenario, but I think most people for now are expecting more Trump just to be distracted with the Middle East, with Iran, and to kind of take this topic and his attempted facilitation of talks between Russia and Ukraine, take kind of slightly of a lesser kind of profile on this and slightly push that aside. We've already had indications some of these talks with US participation are not going to happen or going to be delayed. And I think there is a sense that, you know, Russia wasn't even looking particularly keen or to get to any kind of ceasefire even before, but now with the prospect of more money coming in and less potential, you know, defense support in terms of air defenses for Ukraine, that, you know, disincentivizes them making any concessions. So there's a sense that Russia now thinks this is, you know, longer term, middle term, working in their favor, and there is an expectation for most people here in Ukraine that at least this summer, basically, we're going to have another full-out kind of summer of battlefield movement and no real change.
Well, we'll leave it there with Nick Connolly in Kyiv. Thank you very much for joining us. I want to take a moment to actually bring you up to date on some of the latest developments in the U.S.-Israel war on Iran, especially if you are just joining us. Azerbaijan has summoned Iran's ambassador after it says 2 drones hit its autonomous Nakhchivan enclave, or exclave rather. One drone struck an airport, while another crashed near a school building. Iran has denied launching the attack. Israel's strikes on Iran continue with renewed attacks on Tehran this morning. Explosions have been reported across the city. Israel's military is also striking Lebanon and what it says are targets linked to Iranian-backed Hezbollah. Now, Iran's launched fresh strikes on Israel with Gulf states with U.S. bases across the region. 6 people have been injured by falling debris from an intercepted drone in Abu Dhabi. And Iran's foreign minister has called the U.S. sinking of an Iranian warship a, quote, atrocity, and says it will come to bitterly regret it. And that's in reference to a U.S. submarine having torpedoed the Iranian warship that was in international waters off Sri Lanka. So this is very much a conflict that has expanded beyond the Middle East, frankly, from Cyprus all the way to Sri Lanka.
Can I jump in there before you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Before you keep going on, because I know that there's a lot of energy in the chat right now with people wanting to know about what's going on in Azerbaijan and the ramifications of that drone hitting the airport there in terms of the conflict spilling over. And this seems like a good opportunity to bring that in. Is that something that...
Well, the Iranians have denied it, which is interesting. I think it shows us they want to make sure that they stay on good condition with Azerbaijan. They were saying this is not part of their policy, that they're usually hitting places they are harboring and supporting U.S. war efforts. So Azerbaijan is a very interesting country in the sense that it has been one of the very few ones in the region that have managed to play on both sides, to stay close with Iran, but that at the same time has very close ties with Israel, including Abraham Accords, including a lot of energy and oil that comes through Azerbaijan to Israel. And of course, there's always been a somewhat of a suspicion and a lot of fear when it comes to those. There's always been very tense between Iran and Azerbaijan. There's an Azeri minority in Iran, but also Iran is very aware of the warm relations between Azerbaijan and Israel. Israel has also helped the Azeris with their fights in the Nagorno-Karabakh, and that's a fine line. But Iran tries, as we've seen so far, tries to push the conflict far from its immediate borders. And I can imagine how starting a war with an immediate neighbor that shares a border on the north of Iran, that could be something that they're very much afraid of. And I can see how maybe there was a miscalculation. Maybe it's a sign of some of the chaos or problem with control and command, which could be only understandable under the conditions Iran is in. Yeah, that's a bit of a nutshell of where we stand on the Azeris.
I'm sure our viewers will be very thankful for that analysis.
Yeah, thank you very much, and keep those questions coming. And now we're very happy to welcome Mariana Rittervold, research professor at the Arena Center for European Studies at the University of Oslo. Welcome. I think you've been hearing from our correspondent in Ukraine. You've been hearing parts of his answer just now about the ripple effects for Ukraine. Not sure if you want to add any more of that, but would love your thoughts on the impact on Ukraine.
Yes, thanks for having me. So as Nick already mentioned, the challenge for Ukraine and for Europe is that this diverts US attention away from Ukraine. And that is bad for Europe and Ukraine for 2 reasons. One is that the EU needs the US to be involved in this. It needs to be interested in solving this conflict and use pressure to push Putin towards the negotiation table to find a solution to this, a peaceful solution. And the other reason is what Nick also mentioned, linked to the stockpiles, because Ukraine depends on US military support. Even if the US doesn't provide it directly, the Europeans buy American weapons, and also the Ukraine needs surveillance and intelligence support from the US. And of course, these military supplies, they will run out at some point. They are not unlimited. So the risk for Ukraine, and Zelensky also already mentioned this, is that this will kind of divert important weapons away from Ukraine, and that will be used in the Middle East instead.
I want to play a soundbite from Kaja Kallas, the EU's top diplomat, and I'd love for you to just react to that. Have a listen.
There is clear impact on the war on Ukraine as well, because there is defense capabilities that are needed in Ukraine now moving also to the Middle East. There is also the issue of supply chains, of supplying the capabilities that Ukraine needs, now also the Middle East needs when it comes to air defense, for example. And there is also the issue of the oil price. So the oil price, when it goes up, it actually benefits Russia to fund its war, and that's why we have to really push through the maritime services ban, that we can really curtail the shadow fleet and the oil revenues that Russia has to fund its war.
So it sounds like Europe is caught in a very difficult position.
Absolutely. And that also goes for the transatlantic relationship at large, because I think that this is kind of yet another nail in the transatlantic coffin, so to speak. The EU and the United States, they have different threat perceptions. The EU doesn't love the Iranian regime, but the EU would like to see a different type of solution to this. These challenges with Iran. They want a negotiated solution, they want a diplomatic solution. So this is like, and the United States didn't even consult its European partners, which is very different from previous interventions in the Middle East. But the EU is mostly worried with Russia. That is the big threat for the EU. And now, as we've been talking about, the US attention is diverted away from seeking a solution. Supplies might run out, defense capabilities in particular, like the Patriots that we talked about, and also it feeds into to Russia's war coffin. So it is a challenge, but the EU is trying to do it, has many tools that it can apply. So it's about sanctions, and it's also about what also Nick mentioned about buying oil and gas from yes, and so, but they also need to kind of find ways also now to step up their attempts to support Ukraine economically and militarily. So that also goes to discussions about how they can find money to fund the Ukraine's defense efforts.
Okay, so we were talking about Ukraine. I want to talk a little bit now about, you've been talking about the EU, but European countries have been responding differently to things taking place in the Middle East. France and Germany have been at odds over so many things, one can imagine. They see the Iran war differently as well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, the EU member states and the NATO allies, they have different perspectives, for example, on how the United States can use their various military bases. But I think overall, the main approach and the main response has been that we don't like this type of military aggression, and we don't see the need to try to solve these challenges that we have with the Iranian regime through military means. So there is, in general, not much support for that. Of course, Rutte said earlier today that he supports the US attack and the removal of Khamenei. But it's also important to keep in mind that that is his personal opinion. It is not NATO's kind of official opinion in this regard, because any kind of common opinion from NATO or any NATO involvement would require unanimity amongst the member states. His job is to try to keep the alliance as united as possible, create consensus, and try to keep the United States on board. But any NATO involvement would not be possible because there are so many, and most European states are not interested in that, and some also oppose it very clearly.
A very complicated situation. Hannah, what's been happening in chat? Has there been any questions for our expert here?
Yeah, we've had lots of questions in general. And Marianne, I wonder if it's maybe a little bit too cheeky for me to ask a question like this, since you're so focused on politics and strategy. But a lot of our viewers want to know if everything that's going on, especially with regards to how Europe is getting involved, will it impact travel to Europe this summer in particular?
Well, it depends on how this conflict evolves, how much it spreads. And I'm not sure. I don't know the military details in that regard, how strong Iran is, how many European targets it could reach. But of course, a worry in the EU now is also, and in European countries, is also that this will increase the risk of terror attacks, for example. So I'm sure there will be a lot of focus on kind of preventing and limiting that threat. Then we have the Cyprus situation, where even if Cyprus is not in NATO, it is a EU member, and the EU also has its Article 5, so to speak. It's Article 42.7. I don't see any immediate risk that this will kind of spill into a conflict involving European allies in Europe. But of course, as long as when the world is a more uncertain place and when there is conflict in the EU's neighborhoods, it could potentially spill over to Europe. But I think that is also something that the EU member states are focusing a lot on now. How can we kind of prevent and stabilize the situation to avoid also this threat of terrorist attacks and cyber attacks, for example, that we also will see increase now.
Yeah, that's another front that people tend not to think of, the non-physical front, the digital front, for sure. So just to clarify, you think that the Cyprus incident, it isn't, well, of course it is dangerous, but it's unlikely to situations like that. I mean, I wonder whether it doesn't sound like you think there are going to be escalations on that front.
Well, hopefully not. But I think that trying to predict anything today is really hard. I think many of us have learned our lessons in that regard. But I think that also the fact that so many European countries are now showing their support to Cyprus is also to try to prevent this from escalating, to deter a conflict. I mean, that will always be the main focus of European states, not to kind of engage in conflict, but try to deter a situation that is challenging. So I don't see it as a big challenge now, but as I said, I'm not a military expert, so I don't know what the Iranian capabilities are in that regard, but I'm not sure if they would also either have an interest in kind of engaging in an even broader war. But I think it's safe to go to Europe, if that was the question. But I think there will be much more focus on these broader hybrid threats now because of the situation.
I wonder if I can quickly ask, how much closer is Europe then to having a joint EU defence force, which is something that's been discussed back and forth, not with getting much momentum? Maybe the Europeans are starting to realise that strategic conditions in the region are changing dramatically, and they need to be more active in finding a new positioning, a new footing in this world.
Yes, I think this is yet another push in that direction. We've seen the EU and Europe increase its focus on security and defense first since after the full-scale invasion in 2022. The re-election of Trump has been a huge push in this direction as well. And I think there's really a change in the way that Europe thinks now about its foreign and security and defense policies, that there is acknowledgement that Europe needs to be much more independent. It needs to stand on its two own feet. The United States will hopefully keep its kind of nuclear umbrella, its crisis response, but much of or even most of the conventional defense will have to be taken over by the Europeans. And lots of different situations, events have kind of triggered that or led in that direction. The last, of course, being Greenland, which was a really strong push in this direction. And now I think this is kind of moving this even further atop on the EU agenda because, as I mentioned, it is a even further weakening of the transatlantic relationship. Now the trust is really low, and we see all these conflicts playing out in the neighborhood. Then there are some challenges, of course, for example, linked to Hungary. But when it comes to security and defense, this is perhaps the most popular policy area amongst the European population, actually, when you ask them in surveys, for example.
Mariana, we're getting near to the end of our discussion, but I want to check in with the chat to see if there are any questions that viewers have for you, and then we'll let you get going. Hannah, anything? Or if not?
Totally, yeah. I'm just trying to think of something that we can ask you. But Marianne, perhaps we have a question from a viewer here that's asking, Or I suppose a few people, you can probably clarify this for them, are feeling a bit fearful. Even people here in Germany too. Does Iran even have missiles that can strike that far? Due to US presence here, it's pretty scary. Maybe you can talk a little bit about, the situation here in Europe. Worst case scenario, is everyone going to be okay?
Now, that's a hard one to throw at your way. And I know you said earlier that, you're not a military expert, so you can't necessarily say what potential missiles can hit Europe. But I guess one thing we haven't done, and perhaps it was too obvious because we are here in Europe, is what is the feeling in Europe? And we can all say something, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think the general feeling is that we kind of, as you know, we're moving from this more orderly world and a world where order, at least for Europeans, were to a large degree kept by the Americans, by the United States, being the leader of the transatlantic relationship, the NATO, and also the liberal world order more broadly. And now we see instability. We see war in Europe. Now we have yet another war in the Middle East. We have a United States that has a different threat perception than Europe, focusing on other areas than Europe, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that we live in a more difficult world and much more dangerous world than previously, and that this war will affect us indirectly. In terms of refugees, cyber attacks, maybe the increased risk of terror, economically, etc. But I don't see us getting involved in a military conflict here. And I also think that the good thing, even if there are some disagreements between the European states, I think that overall Europe is actually surprisingly almost united when it comes to these different threats. And we have seen them causing European states to get closer together. So that's a good thing. At least we try to cooperate as much as possible, and a lot is going on in Europe these days.
Yeah, the message, United Europe, is a good way to end on. So, Mariana Rittervoll, thank you very much for your time. Really grateful for it.
Thank you.
She had some great final thoughts. I don't know, Shani, if you have some final thoughts to wrap up our conversation.
Well, I think maybe if we're trying to find the positive, I think some European countries can see. I mean, the rage Trump had against this, Spain for not helping. Caroline Levitt, again, the White House spokesperson, yesterday reiterating that Trump is expecting European cooperation. He needs them. Maybe more than they had thought that he would ever be willing to admit. Maybe it's a good thing if we want to think of good thing that can come out of it. Maybe it could be an understanding from the Americans that the Europe can be an asset, despite the very heavy criticism we're hearing all the time from the Trump administration against Europe. We also know about their clear plan to split Europe, and try to strengthen the more right-wing parts of the Europeans. It could be that, understanding the complexity of the region could help Europe with enough good diplomacy reposition itself as a valuable partner and necessary partner for the Americans and Trump, as it's always been, to be honest, yeah.
So not just Ukraine with the cards, but perhaps Europe has some cards up its sleeve as well. Shani Razanas, thank you so much. Of course, Hannah has been so helpful with checking out the chat. And I'm Melissa Chan. We're so glad you could join us for this live stream. And there will be more live streams. You can always check it out on YouTube. It is the DW News channel. And then there's a live tab that you can click on. And that'll take you to our various live streams. And of course, on social media, our handle is @DW News. Thank you very much. Have a good day.